Good afternoon, everyone. Just give us a few minutes. We're waiting for more attendees to join us. You can still see the numbers of attendees increasing. And I can see from the chat box some greetings from Toronto, from Richmond Hill. Okay, we're at 1:02 right now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the college's presentation on the Telepractice Guideline and what practitioners need to know. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Ann Zheng, and I'm the Registrar and CEO of the college. To start, I am delighted to share that this year marks the college's 10th anniversary. I know that in recent times, our college has been met with many challenges. However, it is due to the concerted efforts and support from our council, staff, our stakeholders, including every and each one of you, that we were able to face these challenges. And as such, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to everyone. The college has planned some events for our 10th anniversary and will make announcement in the coming weeks. And I wish to invite everyone to participate in these events. Today's webinar provides an opportunity for you to better understand the Telepractice Guideline. We will be answering some questions at the end of the presentation. As always, we have enabled our Q&A feature, and if you have any questions throughout the webinar, just type them into the box, and we will do our best to answer them. You can also mail your questions to the college afterwards. There will also be a recording of this webinar available on the college website for you to access later. You will be providing a certificate of attendance for this webinar, but would like to remind everyone that you can record your professional development activities in the professional development log, which can be found on the college website for download. I'm happy to be joined today by our special guests, Rebecca Durkin, co-managing partner at Steinicke McCure LeBlanc, and Emily Lee, professional practice advisor. Behind the scenes, there are also our amazing supporting staff, Claudia, Jennifer, Sean, Carlos. Thank you so much for your support. Without further ado, we will begin our presentation. Rebecca and Amy, I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. Today's discussion is the Telepractice Guideline, and I'm so happy to be joined by Rebecca Durkin to clarify some of the key points of telepractice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, most of our work environments changed, and we had to adapt to alternative methods from in-person services. Telepractice has grown exponentially in the recent years. As technology evolves, and is increasingly integrated into the provision of healthcare services, it's expected that telepractice will be more prominent model of care. The College of Traditional Chinese Medicine Practitioners and Acupuncturists of Ontario has developed a guideline to help us understand and navigate this process. So, Rebecca, let's just dive right in. What is the Telepractice Guideline, and where can I find this document?
Good afternoon, Amy. If we could move to the next slide, this might help understand. So the first question is where, I'll start with the second question, where can you find it? So the college has provided this guideline, this helpful guideline on its website, so it's easily available and located on the website. So that's where it can be found. But the concept of, well, at least the content of the guideline about telepractice. What is telepractice? It's basically any sort of utilization or technology that allows healthcare providers to deliver healthcare without direct contact. Okay, so you might be thinking of Zoom, Teams, virtual through sort of virtual means, telephone calls. So ways in which healthcare can be communicated, but not in a traditional direct contact.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this would include, like you just mentioned, like webinars, Zoom, phone calls, texts.
Yes, I would suggest that your college does not prohibit texts as a way to communicate, but as we're going to talk about this afternoon, the more informal your mode of telepractice, the more risks that can be increased for the patient and for yourself. So this college does not prohibit telepractice occurring via text. That being said, practitioners need to be very, very careful to determine if that's the correct mode in which to deliver healthcare.
Okay, so what are some of the things that our members need to understand before we partake in telepractice?
Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, and actually maybe we'll skip out to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So the college and the guideline, the college through its guideline does a very good job of sort of setting out some of these key points that you've just asked about, Amy. The first point I think it's incredibly important for members to remember is that they are accountable for the care that they provide to patients, whether that's direct patient care, whether that's telepractice patient care. You don't avoid that responsibility or that accountability simply because you're providing care in a telepractice way. Second thing that's really important to remember for members is that they have to ensure that even though they are going to be providing care in a telepractice manner, that they are still required to comply with all the other rules, expectations, to comply within the profession's scope, to act within their scope. Practicing via a telepractice mode does not free you of those obligations. Following through with that, again, you have to ensure that you have the competencies to provide safe and effective care through this virtual manner. As we're going to talk about, some methods of treatment are not conducive to telepractice care, and you as a member are expected to be mindful of that. And another important factor that you need to keep in mind is that telepractice can involve providing care completely different location, a completely different province, which can, or a different city, which is one of the great things about telepractice, certain things to get excited about, but it also brings with it certain risks and certain legal requirements that the guideline really does explain to members.
So some of the things to really keep in mind when you're considering telepractice is making sure that it's within the standards of practice as well as the scope of your practice within your provincial jurisdiction.
Yes.
So what are some of the benefits of telepractice and why should members consider this?
So as we just talked about, one of the great benefits is being able to provide care virtually, being able to provide care without being in direct contact. So if you want to provide TCM services in an area that is not heavily populated with TCM practitioners or TCM practitioners, let's focus on that. This is a great way to provide care. It also is a great benefit for patients who have either a lot of difficulty, whether mobility issues, childcare issues, and having to actually leave the office and come down to your clinic. So you can see that there are a lot of benefits for continuity of care and providing care where otherwise it couldn't be accessible.
So also a good way for patients to kind of check in to see, if they don't have to step into your office, but they're making sure that they are continuing with your advice and continuing with just verbal communication, telephone communication via the internet or email. This just is a little bit more accessible, and it's a little bit more efficient and easy to get a hold of and to have a conversation without actually stepping into the office.
Completely agree.
So what are some of the limitations to consider before people start with telepractice?
So yes, when we talk about benefits, we also need to talk about, I don't know, disadvantages but limitations. It's important to keep that in mind. Not everything is going to have an upside. There's going to be corresponding limitations. So members need to be mindful that clearly some form of treatments are not conducive to virtual care. So you heard me kind of catch myself about, a lack of availability of acupuncturists. Clearly, acupuncture, which is a controlled act, which involves going below the dermis, cannot be provided yet virtually. Okay, that's clearly a treatment mode that cannot be provided. But there are probably other TCM modalities and treatments that also could not be provided in this virtual format. So clearly that needs to be kept in mind. Certain tongue pulse palpations, these are practically incapable of being provided in a virtual manner. And so it's going to be really important for members to be aware of that and to ensure that if they wish to go down this route, they're very upfront with patients. Remember, members know what's available. Members know what's involved in different treatments. A lot of patients aren't aware. So you're going to need to be very clear and very upfront that some of your services, some of your treatments simply cannot be provided in a telepractice manner.
So can we sort of give an example of some of the things that are acceptable for telepractice?
So I would say, again, if you look at the scope of the profession, if you look at the realities of the profession, I think it would be fair to say, and I, to be frank, would probably defer to you a lot of this, Amy, as a practitioner, but, initial assessment and monitoring. I really liked what you said earlier about, that sometimes that touching base, in the before times, appointments might have been just restricted for dedicated treatments or dedicated discussions, larger discussions, whereas telepractice might provide those abilities to have those things that wouldn't have warranted a full, perhaps, visit to the clinic. Maybe now they do warrant those follow-ups, those touch-ups in between. Home-based modalities, discussion of perhaps the appropriate herb medicines that patients can access, dietary therapy, lifestyle advice. So there are clearly, arguably, depending on the patient, because of course this has to be patient focused, there may be some services, treatments that can be provided, and we really would be in the best interest of the patient sometimes to be provided in that way.
Yeah, I totally agree because, sometimes when they are in the office and you administer a new herbal medication, right? And you want to check up on your patients to make sure that things are going well. So usually what happens in my practice is if I've prescribed a prescription to a patient, I usually check in within the first 2 days just to see how they're feeling. They not necessarily have to come into the office for me to check in with that, but often I'll send a quick email just to see if anything has changed, if we need to alter. At the same time, during the pandemic, some people may have had, let's say the weather changes and then they have headache and they're wondering which acupuncture points that they could use as far as acupressure to add for themselves, right? So a lot of these moments became teaching moments because they were able to palpate the sore spot and be able to massage it out, or like some of the more popular points for headaches and things like that. I was able to provide that without them actually kind of stepping into the office, and sort of our discussion went a little bit further, and our communication and our connection came together a little bit better too, just because I was a little bit more readily available to discuss without having somebody to come into the office. So I
Great
think
points.
this is a really, really great idea. When is telepractice not acceptable?
Okay, so we talked about some of the practical treatment barriers, but as a regulator, the college has to ensure, of course, that certain requirements, certain measures always serve and protect the public interest. And there are two sort of areas that the college wants to flag where it will not accept or does not believe that telepractice would be appropriate. So the first area that I would alert applicants and members to is the clinical experience requirement. The clinical experience requirement is a requirement for all applicants who wish to become registered in the general class, that they essentially have to complete a program, and this is the language in your regulation, program of clinical experience that involves a specified number of hours of direct patient contact. And so because the language of the regulation, which is passed by the legislature, the Ontario government, because it includes that language, direct patient contact, the college, considering the statute, the legislature's intent is saying that telepractice hours will not satisfy this requirement. So if you are in a clinical program and they utilize telepractice for your clinical experience, those hours are not going to be acceptable for the college to meet that requirement. Okay, that direct patient contact is going to be required, and the rationale is that when you're learning, when you are understanding what is a safe way to practice, having that direct contact is really obviously very important, and having that presence, physical presence with the person so you can actually truly understand. So that's something the college really wants to ensure future applicants and members, if they are asked by future applicants, that they're mindful about, okay? The second area that the college wants to flag, again, from a regulatory perspective, is that sometimes the college may require certain members to practice under supervision. So there may be a host of different reasons and rationales why that from a public interest perspective, this is a requirement. And so when that occurs, again, because of the intent of this provision, because of the desire to protect patients, but assist the member to learn, telepractice supervision will not be acceptable. That when a college committee imposes a supervision requirement, that the supervisor has to be physically present at that treatment location. And again, this is not meant to be punitive. This is just from that public interest perspective, and also fairness and clarity to the member, that they receive that supervision in the physical presence of their supervisor.
Great, thanks. What are some of the jurisdictional considerations?
Okay, so I mentioned that earlier, and the guideline provides us with great clarity. But we're in this sort of interesting time where, you know, you can click a Zoom link and access health practitioners all across the country, which is fantastic. But the law is still maybe a slower, lumbering beast, and the law is still saying, how do we handle this, right? The law isn't as quick just to click a button. From a regulatory perspective, what has to happen here if you are a patient seeking treatment from someone who is not in your province? And I'll just flag out, in Canada, the regulation of professions is a provincially based power. So this is not the college creating a barrier. Legally, the courts, the Constitution have set out that this is a provincial by provincial organizational issue. So essentially what members of this college need to be aware of is that if they obviously wish to provide TCM care in Ontario, they have to be a member of the college. That's not too difficult to comprehend. But if that member wishes to treat a patient, let's say in British Columbia, so the member might be present in Ontario, the patient is present in British Columbia. From a legal perspective, the courts have said, okay, so where is the care provided? And what the courts thus far have said is that the care is provided both in the home jurisdiction, i.e. where the member is located, and also where the patient is located. So what does this practically mean? It means if you are a member registered in Ontario and you wish to treat a patient registered in British Columbia, you're going to have to be registered in both Ontario and British Columbia. Now, you may provide treatment in some jurisdictions that are not regulated. TCM is not fully regulated in every province or country. And in that situation, you're going to want to ensure you technically, you couldn't be registered in a province that doesn't regulate TCM. So you don't have to be registered in that second province, but your accountability will remain, and you need to ensure that that patient in the province that's not regulated is mindful and aware that legally the care is being provided here in Ontario. But what the college really wants to ensure and really put on members' radar is that it might be easy to click that Zoom link, or it might be easy to send that email, but from a regulatory perspective, because you're a regulated health professional, the college needs to ensure that you're aware that there are issues at play. And so before you engage in treating patients outside of the province of Ontario, you're going to want to ensure that you're legally allowed to do so.
Okay, that's really interesting. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more about the examples? Like I'm kind of confused as far as, so the wording is interesting because if I'm registered in Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
I am able to treat somebody in British Columbia, but I have to abide by my Ontario registration regulatory body rules.
Right?
Is that what you're saying?
Well, but not, so yes, you always have to comply with your regulatory rules. So remember, people aren't forced to become a member of a regulated profession. If they wish to become a member of a regulated profession, such as this profession, they agree to follow the rules of their regulator. That's the model.
Right.
Now, so you always have to follow the rules of your regulator, but if you provide treatment in a second jurisdiction, if your patient is in a second jurisdiction, and that second jurisdiction is a regulated jurisdiction, which British Columbia is, you would also have to be registered to provide TCM care in British Columbia. So
Oh,
you simply couldn't say, oh, I'm complying with my Ontario rules, so here I go, I'm going to go over there. So you can see it can get a bit tricky.
right.
Again, the law is still trying to catch up, but as of March 2023, and until members are advised otherwise, they need to be aware that if they want to engage in telepractice, and remember, no one's forcing members to do so. So if they wish to engage in telepractice, they have to ensure that they're complying with not only the rules of the college, but of any other rules of where the patient resides. And if that patient resides in a regulated jurisdiction, members have to also be registered there, because otherwise they're providing care in British Columbia without being registered. And that is a break of the regulatory rules.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks for clarifying that, because I think that there's sort of like a gray area with telepraxis. Well, I'm registered here and licensed here, so it shouldn't be a problem. However, with what you're saying is that it should be in both, or
Exactly.
wherever it is. So
Exactly.
how does this affect my insurance,
Mm-hmm.
or personal liability insurance?
Really good question. So, and members some understandably kind of get a bit confused, because members know the college requires, and this is a requirement, that all members carry professional liability insurance. And I will let you know that all 26 health colleges, this is a requirement in every health college in Ontario. Okay, the government insisted that this occur. So the college insists that you have professional liability insurance, and it has to meet certain criteria, certain coverage claims, but the college does not necessarily dictate who you obtain the insurance from. It just says, we trust you members, here's what it has to include, now go forth. So what this means, Amy, is that different insurance providers may cover telepractice, different insurance providers may not. The college does not liaise or communicate with the insurers. It's a separate organization. The college doesn't run the insurers, it's completely separate. So the college, again, really encourages their members to ensure that their insurance policy permits them to engage in this form of practice. You are practicing. You're practicing, albeit in a different vehicle, different mode, but at the end of the day, you're practicing. And if you're practicing, you need to ensure that how you've decided to practice is covered through your insurance policy. So it's really, really important that if members decide to go down this path, that they first check and ensure that they have proper insurance coverage.
So our members need to check with their own personal insurance
Exactly.
companies to allow for them to make sure that they are covered with telepractice.
Exactly. Because if your insurance company says no,
right.
if you provide patient care in a telepractice, we are not going to cover any claim. That's a pretty quick reminder to that member to say, okay, I can't do this. I can't engage in telepractice care unless I try and find insurance coverage that permits me to do so. So that's a situation where the college has not quite obviously told members that they can't do it. Okay.
Right.
But the member trusts, the college trusts members because they are professional, they are educated, they are aware, that they're aware that they have to ensure that their insurance coverage permits them. And if their insurance coverage says, no, you are not covered for this, if you want to, you might have to pay more, or if you want to, you might need to go to another service provider. The college trusts members to recognize that unless they are insured to provide those services, they will not do so.
Okay. Thank you. Can we talk a little bit about privacy and confidentiality and how that applies to telepractice?
Sure. So again, remember, telepractice still involves providing care. And the traditional model of providing care is that the practitioner, the patient would be in an enclosed room usually with a door or a curtain. So there would be automatic tools to ensure confidentiality. When a member decides to provide care in a virtual or telepractice manner, we've gone outside of the traditional model, right? There's no longer a door to close. There's no longer a curtain to pull. So practitioners need to ensure that they put in place necessary privacy measures. Okay, so first, obviously, any patient information, personal health information is the legal term, but any personal health information is kept confidential, okay? And traditionally, that would be making sure your records are kept private and confidential and locked away and not accessible. But again, if members are deciding to go outside of that traditional model and want to provide care in a virtual manner, they're going to have to take additional steps to ensure that they are putting in place a virtual door or a virtual curtain so that the patients can enjoy that confidentiality.
Right. Well, how?
Okay. Yeah, how?
How?
Yeah.
How do we know that it's being met by each member?
Okay. So again, what the guideline will do is it provides sort of reminders, flags, because the college knows that members know that patient confidentiality is really important. So whether it's in-person care, whether it's virtual care, clearly it's important, okay? But you know, what should be considered when virtual care is being provided? So simple things. You need to ensure, I think if the next slide, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start on the second bullet first, private space. So although you don't have a physical door or a physical curtain to pull, the college is going to remind members to ensure that they themselves should be in a private space. They should not be engaged in a restaurant. You shouldn't be treating patients while you're in a restaurant. You shouldn't be treating patients when there are other people around who can hear the discussion. For obvious reasons, right? You know, the college will probably encourage patients, obviously, to be in a space that doesn't allow too much interaction and too much exchange. But the college has jurisdiction over the member. So the college is going to tell the member, you have to ensure that your patient has confidence that when they are engaging in this interaction with you, that no one can hear what they're saying to you. Practitioners receive incredibly sensitive and personal information from patients about pain, about parts in their body, about emotional or physical health. That has to be kept within a confidential realm. So telepractice visits should only be conducted in private space. Assume that you are treating in person. And so that's a good prompt as to where you should be to ensure that you're going to be providing that confidentiality. What about the fact that you now are engaging in this virtual mode of treatment? You know, your phone, your computer, your email, and however you are communicating with your patient, you need to ensure that they are protected. You'll recall in the early day of Zoom, what were they called? The Zoom bombing. People would be on conferences, and suddenly someone could access the conference and appear in and attend the conference or the meeting. That can't occur when you are providing health care because of the legal obligation to ensure confidentiality. So you're going to want to ensure that the devices you utilize or the programs you utilize has sufficient protections built in place to prevent that from happening. And again, just to build on what we talked about earlier, the college will encourage members to have discussions with their patients to ensure that they themselves are not in an area where things can be heard. The college, the member is going to encourage patients to be in an area where they can be fully, they can disclose, they feel comfortable talking about this information. But again, the college is going to really want to put it on members' radar that if they decide to offer care in a virtual manner, that measures are put in place to ensure that no one can hear, unintentionally or otherwise. This has to be a core. You really need to, again, think of yourself, would I be providing care in a park? Would I be providing care in a restaurant with all these people around? Of course not. So take that mindset that you apply for in-person care, apply that mindset to your virtual care, and that will reduce the risks of any privacy or confidentiality being breached.
And a lot of the times, when the patients are in our private offices, I don't feel that it's any different than if you were on a Zoom call or if you were doing a telepractice session, right? You just kind of have to assume that your professionalism stays exactly the same because it is a one-on-one situation.
Exactly.
You wouldn't be at the mall and saying, "Hey, tell me all about what's going on with your health." That would never ever happen. So why would it happen outside of your office, right?
Exactly. And Amy, you've really hit on something really important, is that whether you provide care virtually or in person, you're providing care. So,
Right.
so today's session and the guideline is talking about how that care can be provided in a telepractice manner. But at the end of the day, it's care. At the end of the day, all of the expectations and responsibilities that members have when providing in-person care, it still exists and applies in the telepractice way. There's some benefits to telepractice. There are some additional risks to telepractice, but members need to keep in mind that they are providing care. So all those usual parameters need to be kept in focus.
Right, and stressing it's the same level of professionalism. They're still seeing the same person. It's just in a different capacity. What are some of the important things to remember when it's a phone call or video conference sessions?
So interestingly enough, obviously, because we're now in this virtual way and so many, whether it's phone calls or Zoom calls, you now have option to record. And I think it's really important that, you usually wouldn't have a video camera in your clinic room when you're treating someone. Ergo, you shouldn't be recording your virtual sessions, even though that capacity is available. Now, to be clear, if it's deemed to be important and relevant, and if the patient consents, because of course everything has to be based with the patient's interest in mind. If the patient consents, then that may be permissible, assuming of course any recording is stored in a way to ensure confidentiality. You can see how these risks increase the more that you decide to bring on. But yet, just because you have the ability to record and think, oh, this would be a great way to remember things, no, that's not how it should occur unless the patient consents and unless you're going to be able to guarantee that recording is kept in a confidential manner. Again, if we're talking about a first visit, just as you just said, when you're meeting someone, you might want to ensure verify identity, right? So, and maybe I'm getting a little too worrisome here, but you want to ensure, am I talking with the right person? Is this the right email? I've received all this healthcare information that you might have sent in advance. You want to make sure that you're talking to the right person before you engage in that. So that'd be another flag to verify, to ensure there's verification. You mentioned earlier about how email is such a great tool. It's such a great tool to be able to touch in but you're providing care, you're touching base, you're wanting to see how your patient's doing. You are providing either information or the patient's providing you with information. So right there, we're within that ambit of care being provided. You want to ask yourself, are some discussions perhaps not appropriate? Are some check-ins not appropriate via email? That's going to be something that you really want to consider. Back to what I've said earlier, remember, all of this is care. All of this falls within the exact same level of standards and expectations that the college has for in-person care. So when you are interacting via email, has that formed part of the record, right? You're not emailing the patient to say, are you watching the Oscars this weekend? Or what's your favorite movie? That's not a proper dynamic between practitioners and patients, right? Professional boundaries needs to ensure that that does not get blurred. So if you're emailing with the patient, you're clearly providing care. So you want to, and there's that record keeping expectation and standard imposed upon you. That's another factor that you're going to want to consider.
Right. So when considering the verification of the patient's identity, it's important to understand and know who has access to that email, who has access to that text. I know we're going to talk about consent later, but I just sort of want to drill in that that professional capacity does not change, whether it's virtual, email, text. The level of professionalism will always remain the same, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So the next thing I want to ask is, can we talk about technology that's necessary to engage in telepractice?
Okay. So as we've been talking about, there are a lot of benefits to technology, but there are also risks, okay? And members need to appreciate that before they embark on providing care in a telepractice way. So whether it's ensuring that you have enough blocks up, barriers up, protections up, walls up to prevent Zoom bombing, to ensure that hacking cannot occur, to ensure that you have enough data storage, that in the middle of do you have enough Wi-Fi access? Do you have a steady source of internet? All of these are going to be on your radar now if you decide to provide care in a telepractice method. I'm going to probably preempt a question that you might have, Amy, because I see it red on the screen. The college cannot provide or recommend a specific technology provider. Okay, that would be somewhat outside of the scope of the college and probably an improper exercise at the college. The college provides standards, it sets out expectations, but the college shouldn't get too granular into the life of the member that mandates who they should obtain their internet or bell or phone services from. Okay, but the college is putting on members' radar that they need to ensure that whatever service provider, internet, phone, service provider, whatever technology, apps, programs that they utilize, they decide to use to provide telepractice, that the member has done their due diligence. Has the member asked the provider, hey, how do I ensure that there's no corruption, that people can't interfere, that people can't inject themselves? How can I ensure that this link will be not corrupted and people are going to be able to have access? These are the questions that members, regulated health professionals, should be asking because they want to make sure, and the college knows this, the members want to make sure that their patients are safe, that their patients have confidence in providing this information to a member. So it's only proper that members ask the service providers or the app providers these questions, and then the member is going to have satisfaction that, okay, my patient's data is going to be safe.
So, you know, I guess it just also goes back to how you keep everything private within your own office, right? It's no difference. It's no different than having your files that have the password protection, having your patient's privacy of health information act is in place, right? So all of these points, there's no difference. There's no difference in how you keep
Exactly.
the safeguard of your own clinic files as you would for your files via telepractice. Okay, so what are some of the safeguards to consider for privacy
Okay.
purposes?
I'm gonna again pick up on what you've said, and it's so important that essentially the same the considerations you take into that you consider when you're providing in-person care still need to be present when you're providing virtual care. It's just going to pivot a bit. Okay.
Hmm.
So as you said, you know, when you have patients coming into the office, you quite understandably will not have other patient charts open on the desk so that
Right.
everyone can come in, right? That's kind
Mhm.
of a given. That's sort of obvious.
Yeah.
You have these measures put in place to ensure that information is kept up to patient information is kept up to date, patient information is kept confidential, that any members of your team are all operating from the same book, that everyone is aware of the confidentiality obligations. Everyone is aware of the duty to keep patient information confidential. So having these safeguards that you would have in your traditional brick and mortar clinic is just as important to have if you decide to go into telepractice. So you're going to want to look at your policies, your administrative practices to see, okay, how does this work now if I'm going to provide telepractice? What measures, what policies are we going to put in place so that everyone's in my clinic is on the same operating page? And again, that we can reassure patients. So we can tell the patients, here's our policy on practicing telepractice. Here's how you can have confidence that we're going to keep your information confidential. So those are ways in which the member can demonstrate that they're adhering to these privacy obligations. Technically, practically, what does this mean from a technological perspective? So again, depending on the mode of virtual care you're providing, you're going to want to look at the authentication, if there's anonymization of patient information, if redaction is necessary, if passwords or encryption is necessary. Again, it's going to depend on what you're relaying and communicating. But if you're utilizing some form of software to have these discussions, or is it being kept up to date? Are you paying the licensing fees? Are you doing all the things that are necessary to ensure the integrity of the structure? So if you're going to provide telepractice, think of your brick and mortar clinic as being your telepractice, and you're going to want to ensure, just like you would with your clinic, keeping it up to date, clean, professional looking. You're going to have those same mindsets to your telepractice clinic. And again, electronically, even if you don't provide telepractice care, but you're engaging in, let's say, electronic records, same sort of principles, right? We're into that electronic world. You need to ensure that there is absolute confidence that the information that is gaining retained is confidential, is accessible when needed, but is
Right.
kept confidential. So introducing technology, whether we're talking about electronic health records or providing care technologically, does introduce additional risks, but you can see that a lot of the risks per se, a lot of the issues are quite similar to what you should be thinking about anyway when you are providing healthcare.
So that kind of segues us into consent. What do we need to consider when we're talking about consent?
Okay, so the basic fundamentals, remember, same rules apply. You're providing healthcare. So the Healthcare Consent Act and all the informed consent rules that apply to treatment apply in telepractice, right? Hopefully we're drilling this home. There's really no difference. If you're providing treatment, whether in person or virtually, those same rules apply.
Mhm.
That being said, if you decide to not provide if you decide to provide care in just not the traditional way in person, but if you also wish to provide care in a telepractice, there are additional safeguards that you need to consider. So you're going to want to ensure that you have the patient's consent, right? Which I'm assuming is going to have to happen if you're going to be able to link up in the virtual world. But you want to ensure that the patient also is doing so voluntarily. You don't want a patient to feel coerced into providing care this way. Remember, telepractice is a patient focused. This shouldn't be just for the benefit, for the ease of the member. This has to be a mode of treatment that is in fact in the patient interest. So you're going to want to have that consent, that discussion, and make sure the patients agree to this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the whole informed consent. Remember, consent to communicate virtually isn't consent for treatment. That in Ontario, the Healthcare Consent Act mandates that before treatment can be provided, the patient has to consent, has to provide informed consent. And I know the college has a great standard and I believe a webinar on this very issue and all the steps that are required in order to obtain informed consent. And finally, the other sort of additional risk, because you are deciding to engage in this sort of technologically electronic virtual mode, you're going to want to ensure that you have the patient's consent to not just collect, but store that information in a way that may be conducive to that technological manner. So these are, again, the middle one there is the same as it always is. Informed consent has to be present. But if you decide to go the telepractice route, there are going to be some extra hoops you need to jump through to ensure that you do have the consent of your patient to communicate this way. You do have the consent of your patient to store information, maybe in a slightly non-traditional manner, depending on the mode of telepractice. But these are things that are expected to be kept in mind to ensure that the patient is fully aware and fully informed.
Right. So just to drill this in again, we need to get the consent of the patient for them to know that we're going to be conducting the appointment via telepractice.
Yes.
We need the consent from the patient to perform whatever we're
treatment,
whether it's acupuncture, whether it's herbal medicine.
Yep.
And we also need to have the consent, if we choose to do telepractice, that we are collecting, using, disclose, storing all of the information. So those three are very, very important.
Very.
Okay. So why is record keeping important for telepractice?
So again, continue on with our theme of really reminding members that telepractice care is still care, but just provide an alternative manner. So we know the college has pretty important rules and standards on record keeping, and those rules are there to ensure that the patient has access to the care that's provided, to ensure that members remember the care that's provided. It provides that record of care. So if a member decides to provide healthcare in a telepractice manner, those rules still apply. You still have to comply with the record keeping standards of the college, and that is readily accessible on the website. But as we said, if you decide to go through this route, and you don't have to, but if you decide and the patient agrees that this is the best interest of the patient, certain other things have to be kept in mind. One, you're going to want to ensure that your records reflect that this care, this appointment was provided in a telepractice session. So whether it is a Zoom session, whether it is a phone session, that needs to be set out in your records. And the reason is because if you don't put that in, it's not an accurate reflection of the appointment. We're still in the age where the traditional approach to providing healthcare is in person. So that's why you don't usually see you have to put in person in your medical records, because that's the default, that's the expected route. But if you're deviating from that traditional standard approach and you are providing care either through phone or through a Zoom or some app, you need to put that in, because that's how the appointment occurred. That is an accurate reflection. Okay, so you're going to want to ensure that's reflected not just in your patient records, but I would suggest also on the patient invoice, on their account, that needs to also be indicated, because back to transparency and accuracy. If that's how the session occurred, it's important that that be reflected.
I'm glad that you were stepping into this, because my next question had to do with fees and billing. I know a lot of members have this question about if it is a virtual session, what would the fee schedule be like? Would it be any different?
So you'll recall earlier I said the college is not going to tell members where to get their technology from or their service providers from. The same actually applies to fees. The college trusts members that they know, based on where they live, based on the costs of the treatment, that the member is in the best position to determine their fee schedule. The
Right.
only time the college is going to interfere is if there's a concern where the fee schedule or the fees being charged are abusive, are basically completely unjustifiable. But other than that, the college is going to trust members to decide what the best fee rate is. So the college will not tell members or will not advise members on what the appropriate fee should be for telepractice versus in person. The college trusts members to gauge that on their own. But that being said, if there is a difference in fees for in person or versus telepractice, that has to be provided to the patient in advance of any appointment. Remember, we
Right.
talked earlier, consent, best
Consent.
interest
Yeah.
of the patient. So that is a huge flag that members need to be mindful and aware about. And as we said earlier, back to your invoice, if you do provide services in a virtual manner, that has to be included in your record, health record, and it has to be indicated on the invoice because that is an accurate reflection of how the appointment occurred.
So patients always need to know exactly what they're paying for. So on your fees and billing, if it is going to be a virtual visit, if it is going to be a telepractice session, it needs to be accurately reflected on your receipt.
Yes.
Um, so do the patients have to check with their insurance providers before they engage with you in telepractice or in
So
us?
I would, from a legal perspective, patients would not have to check with their insurance companies. But remember, if the member has advised the patient in advance of their fee schedule, and if it differs for in-person versus virtual, if the member has asked and obtained the consent of the patient to engage in a virtual session, the patient is going to be informed. The patient has information and should be allowed to proceed as they deem appropriate. That being said, some patients' insurance providers may not cover virtual sessions. Again, the college is not in a relationship with the insurers. Insurance companies are separate bodies. Insurance companies enter into contracts with patients. Members, the college, they themselves are not part of that equation. And the college shouldn't get involved in that equation. Right. That would go beyond the role of the college. But it would be very helpful for the patient if members alerted patients, you might want to check because I'm going to put on that invoice because if it was a virtual session, I'm going to put virtual session on my invoice because that's the truth. And I'm a regulated health professional and I have to be truthful. So you might want to check your insurance company to see if that's an issue. But that would be, as long as the member is informing the patient as to the issues, the member is going to be complying with all the expectations of the college. But it would be prudent, you can see from a patient interest perspective, for members to say, you might want to check because it is going to be on the invoice. My college is saying that I have to do this because that's accurate. So you need to be mindful and aware. You can't, patient can't come back to me and say, can you erase that? Because a member has to say, I can't do that. That's not being truthful. That's not being accurate. And my professional integrity and my regulator and compliance with my regulator requires me to be honest.
And I guess that includes having like an open dialogue with your client, with your patient as well,
Agreed.
right? And that goes down to consent. You know, these are our options, and this is something you might want to check with your insurance company to see if you have the coverage for that. So giving people the options as to be if they're going to be coming into your office, whether it's going to be telepractice, whether it's going to be virtual, it's important to have that conversation. I know this, we've covered this a little bit before, but do members have to inform their insurance company about offering telepractice?
So the college's perspective is that they very much should ensure that their policy, and remember, each member might have different policies, but the members in knowing their regulatory responsibility to the college, knowing that they are providing services to patients and that patients have the right to complain, patients have the right sometimes to, well, can sue, the member is going to want to ensure that their policy coverage protects the mode of treatment that they decide to engage in. And really want to drive this home from a legal perspective. My advice to members is, remember, no member is going to be able to say, I was forced into providing virtual treatment. No. If that is a decision that you have made and that the patient agrees to, the college trusts the business operations of members. That being said, the college trusts members to ensure that they are providing care in a safe manner, so that they should always, not just for their patient protection, but for their own protection, contact their insurer to ensure that they are practicing within the ambit of their policy. Because if not, and that's why it's so important to have that discussion in advance of starting any telepractice. Know that information up front, and then you as a member can make that informed decision if you want to go down that path.
That goes back to consent again, right? Like what is your patient consenting to?
Exactly.
And that they have to understand what they've consented.
Exactly. Good point, Amy, because you you want to be able to look at your patient, and if your patient asks, is this totally proper? You want to be able to say, well, I'm complying with my college guideline. I've reached out to my insurer. This is all as a professional, these are expectations, and you want to be able to reassure your patients that you have done your due diligence and that you are in full compliance.
Okay. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is professional boundaries. So I know that we had mentioned before that virtual treatments, virtual consultations are no different than having the patient come into your office. All of those professional boundaries maintain the same. But a lot of the time, when you're texting or emailing, there's a more casual tone to it. So
Agreed.
what are some of the things that we need to know about maintaining professional boundaries with texting, emails, telepractice, etc.?
So we see this a lot. And sorry, when I say we, my law firm, we just represent regulators. So we see this a lot. We see that sometimes members struggle with maintaining those professional boundaries when telepractice occurs. Most usually when we're getting into sort of the texting and or emailing, that's where the real risks can pop up. So as you said, Amy, whether you provide care in person or whether you provide care virtually, the professional boundary line must be maintained. It is in the interest of the patient, and sometimes the patient might want to relax the relationship, might getting a bit casual, might be sending you funny texts and funny emojis. And it's up to the professional. It's up to the member to maintain and reassert those boundaries. So the responsibility will always rest with the member, okay? As you've said, telepractice does provide an opportunity to lessen the rigidity of those boundaries. And you said something that I think was so important. You said, it's a great tool to develop more of a connection, which is exactly correct. But I know it's really important that even when you're creating that connection, it's always in a professional manner, right?
Yes.
So you need to be mindful that when you are communicating, it has to be professional. Because it's only professional communications, you're going to keep a record of all of those communications. That would include text messaging, right? Even if it's just, sometimes I know some members might just confirm appointments, or their front end staff just might confirm through text messaging that an appointment occurred. And if it's just confirming appointments, that would still need to be recorded somewhere in the record that this was confirmed, because that all professional interactions need to have that record. So I think it's members need to be mindful and aware that there is an increased risk that when you engage or communicate via telecommunication, you need to ensure that you're always professional. You need to be prepared that the patient might think this is a lessening of the wall, and it's not. So it's going to be up to you to maintain that. Some practical tips, and again, this is, you know, maybe the boring lawyer in me, but be mindful like of emojis. Be mindful of acronyms.
Right.
And even though that's how we all speak that way when we're speaking to our friends or our children or our colleagues on text, the patient-practitioner relationship is special. The patient-practitioner relationship is at a higher level. So if you avoid those methods of communication, you're going to minimize the risk that the patient's going to get confused. And remember, this is all about the patient. You want to ensure at all points in time that the patient is aware that they view you as their healthcare professional, that they come to you because of your competence, of your knowledge, and that they at all times can expect that level of professionalism. So be mindful of the risks, be prepared if the patient tries to lower the boundaries, tries to blur the boundaries. Always be mindful that it's up to you to reassert those boundaries and avoid the usual steps we all take, and always communicate in a professional manner, and that will mitigate this risk of boundaries getting blurred.
Right. And at the same time, you're in the driver's seat, right? You can steer that conversation, and you can shut it down as quickly
You
as
said
you
it.
need to.
And it might be, you know what, this isn't going to work. You might then say, no, we're not going to communicate by text anymore. We're not going to communicate by email anymore. Not in an abrupt fashion, obviously, keeping in mind the patient's interest. But you've said it, Amy, the responsibility rests with the professional. And if the professional senses that the boundary is getting blurred, it's up to the professional to reassert and get back into that driving seat.
Great, thank you. I know we've already covered this question, but we're getting it a lot. I just wanna reiterate the professional liability insurance.
Yeah.
I know you've already answered this question.
I love it, but it's an important one. Let's do it again.
It's a very important one, and I really want to repeat for our members just to really understand the insurance aspect of telepractice.
And I think the rationale, Amy, is really important. So I really think it's important for members to understand that this is not the college trying to create barriers. This is not the college trying to decrease or impede telepractice from happening. Not at all. What this is a realization. The college is here to regulate the profession and serve and protect the public. So the college is mindful that effective regulation of the profession means informing them, alerting them of risks and issues that could pose, create an inability to treat their patients in a fair manner, okay? It's also recognition that the college is informing members that this is a non-negotiable, that the government has imposed on all 26 health colleges for understandable reasons, that all members must have professional liability insurance. That if, you know, God forbid something goes wrong and a patient has to sue the member has insurance to deal with that. Okay, so you can see this benefits the member and the patient, but this is a non-negotiable. This must be present. The members must have the liability insurance that is set out by the college. But again, if a member decides to deviate from the traditional model and wishes to provide service virtually, some insurance companies might have contemplated that in your policy, some may not. So the obligation is on the member. That obligation is on the member to go to their insurance company before any telepractice is provided to ensure that their policy covers this somewhat different mode of treating patients, because it's still a bit different, right? It's getting more common, but it's still a bit different. So if you want to ensure that you have liability insurance, you need to ensure that you check with your insurance provider before you engage in this treatment. And then you will have the information to decide, do I need to buy another policy? Do I need to go to a different provider? Do I need to stop? Will I just stop, not even go down that route, and I'll just stay the traditional mode? You are informed, but the responsibility is on you. This is not, the college will not be reaching out to every insurance provider. The college trusts members that if they are going to go down this route, it is up to them to ensure that they have made that call.
Right. So the onus is on the member.
Yes.
And the patient, they need to check with their insurance provider to see if telepractice is covered under their insurance policy.
Yeah, if the member doesn't want angry calls from their patients
Mhm.
saying, whoa, you gave me a receipt, it said a virtual appointment, I know I consented to this, but now I'm not being denied coverage. That just shows the importance. As members, you want to have that discussion with your patient in advance and encourage your patients for them to go check with their own insurance coverage. Because if their insurance provider says no, then the patient can make the decision as to whether or not they're going to have that appointment and not be angry with the member 2 months later
Right.
when coverage is denied.
Good. So I'm glad that that's solid information that we all have. Um, we do have some frequently asked questions that I'd like to cover. Um, so we're going to skip to number 2. Can the college recommend software programs for telepractice and record keeping? I know that we covered this briefly, but I think it needs to be stressed again because there seems to be some confusion too.
Sure. Great question. And I get it. The members are saying, I want to comply. College, tell me where to go. I can completely understand the members' questions. But again, back to the role of the college. The college is not going to be able to recommend or direct members as to which programs or whether it's record keeping programs or telepractice software. The college isn't in a position to do that. That's not within its expertise. Okay. Clearly, the college does alert members that there's certain protocols have to be in place. If you have electronic health records, there have to be backups. If you're keeping paper records, they need to be stored in a safe space. So clearly, the college provides enough parameters as to what needs to be present. But the college trusts members that they will go out. They will speak to different providers and maybe associations, maybe even an assistance. We know that the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario on their website, they have information about safeguarding personal health information. So that would be a great list for members to take to different providers and saying, okay, I need to ensure that my patient information is safe. Can you provide this? So the short answer is the college could not and should not tell members what exact programs to use, but the college trusts members that they're aware of the standards of the college and that any program or I guess program that they decide to purchase complies with the expectation of the college.
Okay. I know we had covered this before, but I just want to stress it again. What are some of the risks providing telepractice?
Okay.
I know the answer as far as privacy goes, but just to kind of stress some of the more important points.
So we've talked about the legality risks, right? So you may get into a situation where you are inadvertently practicing TCM in a different jurisdiction. And as we said earlier, healthcare is regulated by province. Not all professions are regulated in every province. So we know that TCM is not regulated in every province, but if you are providing or asked to provide care to a patient in a regulated province, you better be certain that you are also registered in that province,
Right.
because otherwise you're practicing illegally in that province. And the other risk, and again, separate from the jurisdictional risk, is something that we talked about earlier. I think, Amy, you did a really good job of just flagging this for members, is the risk of blurring professional boundaries. This doesn't always have to occur, but be vigilant that even if you are communicating via email, via text, if you're communicating via Zoom or some other virtual app, that level of professionalism is always present. And be mindful that the responsibility is on you to ensure that professionalism remains present. You do not want at any point in time for the patient to get confused. And again, the responsibility will always be on you. So if you decide to go down this route, be mindful of that risk and just ensure that you act in a professional way through your words, your actions, your deeds, and that will send the appropriate message to the patients.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that covers all of the questions that I think I'd like to ask. Maybe Anne has some from the members.
Yes, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rebecca. I know you have covered most of the questions,
Okay.
but there are a few that we have received online during your presentation, if you don't mind. So you covered about the patient's privacy, the appointment should not be recorded. So we received a question from a practitioner. They asked from practitioner's perspective, how can we protect ourselves from being recorded?
Oh, great question. Really good
That's a great
question.
question.
So I think back to what Amy was talking about, the importance of that opening dialogue, right? I think we know as a professional, you need to ensure that the patient is always aware of the consent parameters and the insurance parameters, so that you want that in that opening discussion, the patient always to feel informed as to what's going to be happening. That's also a great opportunity for you to explain to the patient your expectations, right? This is not fully, obviously everything has to be patient-centered care, but this is not a one-way street. You are completely entitled to have an expectation of decorum, integrity, respect towards you. And that frequently could be, I obviously will not record you without your consent, but the same is true. I would ask that you don't record our appointments. So having that built in to the opening dialogue, I would hope will reduce the risk of a patient recording. Now, this sometimes frustrates people, but legally, you know, it's in Canada, it is not illegal to record someone if one person in the room is not aware. So I just want to let you make you mindful that it is not, if a patient says yes, yes, fine, and decides then still I'm going to record the person, it's probably and you're advised that you probably don't, when you might not want to have that person as your patient anymore. You might go through the professional process of discharging them as a patient, but they haven't done anything technically illegal. So I would suggest you have that discussion, be upfront, explain the parameters of this relationship, this two-way relationship. And if unfortunately someone does that without your consent, then that might be an opportunity for you to have a discussion as to whether or not this relationship is sustainable.
And I'd like to interject because, like, sometimes when we do an initial consultation with new patients, it's a lot of information, and perhaps the retention of information is not as good as it used to, and they just sort of want to record your voice just to make sure you're making the right suggestions, or they can follow up with the suggestions later. I often don't have a huge problem with that, but generally in person, they do ask for permission first, and I would give them the okay, just because I realize that, you know, during your consultation, there's a lot of information to take in, and not everybody is going to remember everything that you're saying. And also, TCM acupuncture may be brand new for them, and they're just trying to understand some of the new terminology that they're learning, right? So
Great point.
That in itself, I think open communication is really, really important, and just allowing for your patient to kind of overcome some of the barriers as to why they may be hesitant. They just want to get all of the right info and then maybe look it up later.
Okay, thank you so much. I know you covered about patient live outside Ontario, in BC, for example, but we also received question from a practitioner about telepractice outside of Canada. For example, if a patient lives temporarily out of country.
So legally, you know, the same principles would apply. If that jurisdiction regulated the profession, there is a risk that you could be found to have practiced illegally in that jurisdiction. So clearly there are lots of jurisdictions out there, and I wouldn't be able to provide definitive answer on each jurisdiction. There may be exemptions in certain jurisdictions for providing care in a certain manner within a certain period of time. So it really drives home the importance of being aware, what are the rules in that second jurisdiction? Is there a risk that I am breaking the law in that second jurisdiction? And of course, if you're breaking a law in a second jurisdiction, that's going to cause your home jurisdiction some concern. So you can see this is a risk, right? There are a lot of benefits to telepractice, but there are additional risks. So my advice would be, whenever you are considering providing care in a telepractice mode in a jurisdiction outside of Ontario, A, is it regulated? B, am I allowed to do so? C, if it's outside of Canada, does your insurance provide, we've been assuming a lot of this care is within Canada. Does your insurance provide coverage for you providing care outside of Canada? So there are the additional risks that creep up on that scenario, but the same principles apply. You need to make sure that you are legally authorized to do so.
Do you think it's important to allow for the patient to know that you are only licensed in Ontario and you follow only the rules in Ontario? It may be different for somebody who is physically in British Columbia or, let's say, the United States, right? If you inform your patient that I can speak to you based on what my regulatory body allows me to in Ontario. So first and foremost, this is what I'm able to do within my scope of practice within Ontario. Do you understand? Can we do that?
Amy, are you asking, like, can you speak to someone in a second jurisdiction about what you're doing, what you can do as opposed to treating them? And is that what you're asking?
Well, my question is just to be upfront. Just say, I'm not licensed in British Columbia, but I am licensed in Ontario. Based in Ontario, this is what the information I can give you. Like, just be upfront.
Upfront clarity and accuracy are like dream words to me. As a lawyer, it's exactly what's happening. The one thing I would flag, though, is that the patient, you want to ensure that the patient is fully aware, because the patient might hear all that, but the patient might assume, oh, these are the recommendations. Oh, I'm being treated. And again, unless the patient, there's always going to be a bit of a risk, because the patient might say, oh, well, the member said they would do this if I was in Ontario, so I'm going to go do that. If that patient then files a complaint saying, member 123 treated me while I was in British Columbia, the CTCMPAO are going to say, well, what do you mean that you treated a patient in British Columbia? You're not registered in British Columbia. So you can see, and again, Debbie Downer, lawyer, will always kind of see the risks here, but there's always a bit of a risk that the patient might hear those very accurate words, but still assume that they're receiving treatment.
Right.
So it does pose risks, but to explain to people who ask abroad, I'm registered in Ontario. These are my standards. These are my requirements. I am totally legally permitted to practice in Ontario. For me to practice in another jurisdiction, I have to go through some certain, investigatory steps to make sure that I can do so. I think that would be important.
And having a disclaimer, like having that disclaimer also, like you mentioned before about insurance coverage. Does your insurance provider cover somebody, does cover
depending on the disclaimer, depending on the disclaimer, absolutely clarity, but again, just be mindful that someone just might still interpret what you're providing as treatment, even if the intent was not there. So it still opens up a level of risk.
Thank you. I agree that, and also suggest when practitioners practice, whether online or in person, risk management and assessment is very important.
Very important.
Another question, which is very interesting. So a member said that when I was building a website for my office, the provider indicated to me that it would be better to use my own email to communicate with my patients rather than other suppliers, I guess third-party emails through the website or administrator. And always inform my patients to what software that I am using to communicate with them. How does the college view this matter?
So I don't think I'd be able to weigh in. You know, there are going to be nuances and intricacies of tech that clearly probably beyond the lawyer, but it might be even be beyond the college. The college, again, in my experience, regulatory colleges will not get into the intricacies of different providers, programs. What the college cares about is transparency, is about adherence to standards, about putting the patient's interest first. These are the criteria, these are the pillars that the college will look to, and adhering to the standards. And remember, the college puts all of its standards on this website. So there should never be any confusion. If a matter is important enough to generate a standard, it's really important that members know what that standard says and review that standard. So that would be my legal advice to members, is just to be mindful of the standards that the college expects, and then make sure that your system, your infrastructure aligns with all of those standards.
I would agree. I think no matter what software or email they use, it's important for them to understand how to protect their patient's privacy,
Yes.
How to comply with the college standards of practice, and also clearly communicate with their patients how they're going to communicate with them. There is another, well, actually there are a lot more questions. There's one related to insurance coverage, but I don't know if this is a question for us. It's asked if I provided telepractice to a patient and received a regulatory complaint, would I be able to rely on my professional liability insurance to assist me with responding to the regulatory complaint?
So that would have to be a discussion with the insurer.
Yeah.
Just for other people who are watching, some insurance providers provide legal advice if a complaint is made to the regulator. Some insurance providers do not provide that coverage. It varies depending on insurance coverage, but that would be a discussion that you would have with your insurer. The college wouldn't be involved in that discussion with you and your insurer.
Yes, and I think you mentioned the college will not be able to assist the members with purchasing PLI, professional liability insurance, or negotiate the terms. It will have to be the members' responsibility, or their professional association may have a group insurance policy, so they have to talk to the association.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. I think there are a few more questions, Rebecca and Amy. However, we don't have enough time to cover all of them. Keep in mind that any questions that were not answered will be addressed later. Well, thank you, Rebecca and Amy, for sharing your knowledge with us today, as always. A gentle reminder to our members, the webinar will count towards your professional development hours. Again, as I mentioned, the recorded webinar will be available on the college website at a later date, along with all the questions that were not answered. I encourage you to visit the college website follow our social media, and review the e-newsletters from the college to stay engaged and informed. As Rebecca mentioned, all the standards of practice are on the college website. I encourage you to review the standards and to send any questions to the college if you need more support or help to interpret these guidelines. I hope everyone enjoyed today's session, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.